Hey, all you whiskey fans out there. Today we're going to talk about a very controversial and very interesting topic in the whiskey world, and that's prohibition. Now, today we're going to focus specifically on American Prohibition, and later we'll talk about all the other types which are out there. But there's a few really interesting things that I found in my research, stories I've heard, and I want to share some of those with you. To get started, let's take the easy topic. Was it safe to drink alcohol or whiskey, spirits of any type during Prohibition? The answer is probably no. And we'll get into the reasons for that, but there was a lot of interesting characters in the whiskey world during that time. Of course, the banning of a substance beloved by so many people, well, opens a lot of possible market, let's say, in the world. So there was a lot of people who wanted to get in and sell spirits illegally, import them, and we'll get into those things in a moment. But what's also important is there was legal ways to get it. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and as always, some cool fun facts about Prohibition. To get us started, let's, as like we usually do in this channel, start from the back and work our way forwards. Why was Prohibition lifted? Why was it eventually taken down? And there's mainly two reasons for that. Had nothing to do with religious reasons, had nothing to do about the people, and realistically, it was money. Reason number one was it was very, 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 very expensive to regulate this production of alcohol and the sale of alcohol. So many people were very into and enthusiasts of drinking and whiskey. So there was a lot of black market activity going on. It was expensive to keep hiring the police force and enforcing all these rules. Now, the other side of it is taxes. The US, as well as many other countries in the world, have a very high tax on whiskey or any type of spirits, which means it is very lucrative. And the more whiskey your country buys or you produce, the more money the government is making. So, Prohibition, very expensive, costly to the government, and B, the removal of Prohibition meant that there was more money to be made by taxpayers or taxpayer dollars going into the government and the economy. Usually I like to keep the topics which I discuss kind of short and to the point, but today there's so much interesting things, so bear with me. It's going to be a little bit of a longer video, but it's going to be a good one, I hope. So we're going to start off with seven ways that you could get alcohol or drink alcohol legally or illegally, but were the 7 most common ways for somebody in the Americas to come across whiskey. Number 1 is for medical purposes. Well, I think in today's day and age, we know quite well, whiskey is not quite medicine, at least not to everyone. And it's funny that back in the days of Prohibition, it was actually a very commonly prescribed medicine, whiskey. And the production and the sale of whiskey for medical purposes, however regulated, was allowed and legal. Now, it's not known exactly how many Americans had such a prescription, but it's safe to imagine a lot, because we'll talk about it later. A lot of people were still producing whiskey, and a lot of distilleries which had whiskey in stock or in reserve were still able to sell it, even throughout Prohibition, for medical reasons. And the economy in the US changed dramatically because of this, because now there was a market that could sell a product, a medicine, and markets that couldn't, and there was a lot of demand for it. One of the companies which came up over and over again, and being from the US, I would have never guessed it, is Wallgreens. Wallgreens flourished. It's a pharmacy. I don't know if it's all over the US, but I imagine it is. And it's a very small little store. You can do a whole bunch of things. You can get your camera film made. You can take passport photos. You can get food and groceries. And of course, there's a pharmacy inside too, and sometimes a drive-through pharmacy around the back. What's very interesting is their involvement in the distribution of all medicines, but medical whiskey during that time. Although Wallgreens is not a distillery, they actually ended up buying some distilleries, but also buying a lot of stock from distilleries which were, let's say, closed down or could not sell whiskey on their own, and they were distributing that themselves. Now, there's a lot of interesting numbers, but the one that I found that seemed the most credible was Wallgreens grew from 20 retail stores and locations to over 400. I mean, in some cases, over 500 was reported, but I picked the 400 number because it came from a more reputable source, the National Museum of American History. So let's hope they got it right, but in some places I found it recorded that they had grown to over 500 stores. Now, I'm going to have to read this because there was actually a whole lot, but Wallgreens sold a whole lot of different whiskey, and some of it was whiskey distilled by Walter P. Chrysler, yeah, that Chrysler, Clark Distillery, and they also were able to distribute some under their own name, Wallgreens Distillery, Brown-Forman, Frankfurt Distilleries, and the American Medical Spirits Co. So these are just a handful of names, but they were one of the leading, let's say, saviors of the Prohibition time by being able to provide medical whiskey to the world when it was greatly in demand. Second way that you could get some type of, not whiskey, but let's say alcohol, because alcohol in general was banned, not just whiskey, was sacramental wine. So it's very interesting because, I mean, of course, for religious reasons, the United States being a predominantly Christian and the banning of whiskey being to help or kind of was promoted by religious followers and specifically small groups, but groups of Christians, they couldn't quite get rid of their wine. And this was a small loophole where if you were buying or producing wine for religious ceremonies, you could produce, sell, and drink this, as long as it was for religious purposes. This also led to a so-called boom in attending church, but also in the consumption of sacrificial wines and spirits. Option number 3, and this is by far the worst of the options we're going to cover today, was industrial alcohol. Now, alcohol can be used not only for drinking, but just the compounds, the chemical compounds, maybe you can see it up there, for alcohol. Ethanol is used in a variety of different products and also kind of, let's say, practices. Now, what I mean by that is you can use it to clean, to disinfect, not drinking other types of alcohol, and then also for the production of like rubber and plastics, they use a little bit too. So with this, you could not drink it. And the government actually caught onto this and added things specifically to the production of alcohol, making it even harder and less desirable to drink. Nevertheless, people did do it. And this is probably one of the leading causes of the rumor that moonshine will make you go blind or will cause horrible health defects. Not because the moonshine was bad, but because the producers of that moonshine mixed in a little bit, maybe a little bit too much. I mean, 1 drop is too much, but industrial alcohol, not just consumable alcohol for beverages. Now, I hinted to it before, but of course, number 4 is home distilling or moonshining. Now, we know a whole bunch of stories about this. We've covered it in the past, but of course, moonshining really picked up its roots during this time and was a huge way or huge means of people, especially in the more rural areas or slightly outside of cities and big towns, to come across spirits. Now, that covers people in small cities, but what about big cities and big towns? Well, there's 2 ways, I'm going to kind of group these together, that they ended up getting the spirits to them and to the people. Number 1, which was probably the most on the other side of moonshining infamous, and is still a trend that we see today, is speakeasies. So hidden bars in the back of a building, in cellars, rooms where you could get cocktails, but different types of spirits, beers, and wines. Where did these spirits, beers, and wines come from? Some of them, of course, came from moonshiners, and a large chunk of this actually was imported. Not legally, So many spirits, wines, whiskeys, beers, everything was brought over the Mexican border and of course the Canadian border or overseas. And this was mainly done by crime syndicates. And this is kind of where Al Capone got his name, and a lot of what he did was, amongst other things, was import in whiskey and other products to be sold in speakeasies, because mainly his target market was in the bigger cities, where the smaller cities, they're either producing it themselves or buying it from a local moonshiner. The final and probably okay, maybe not the least tasty, I guess the industrial alcohol is the worst, but the last option was near beer. And near beer became a topic, or became kind of a marketing slogan. And this was a way that many breweries or many, let's say, producers of alcoholic beverages could produce a near beer or near alcohol flavor while not producing anything to directly conflict with the Volstead Act or Prohibition, as many of us know it. And there's also a cool list of people who did this. So for instance, sorry, again, I gotta check out my list here, but Bevo, Pabst, and the infamous Budweiser were all producing so-called cereal beers or cereal beverages, which all had less than 0.5% alcohol in it. So you might get some of the flavors, but not the alcohol, and that was okay. As I mentioned before, these are some ways. I mean, there might be others, but these are usually the more documented ways, at least. Now, for the medical purposes, so let's say the legal ways of getting whiskey, there were, of course, distilleries still running and still functioning. Now, this is crazy for me because I would research this. In one place, I would find 5 or 6 different distilleries. In the other place, 2 or 3. Sometimes the names were the same, sometimes they were different. So I took down a list of all the different distilleries I could find. We're not going to spend too much time on it. We're just going to go over it, with the exception of 1 or 2, which I found interesting, and just things to mention about them. And then some of the distilleries which were even like less mentioned, but still popped up sometimes. And yeah, let's get into it. Again, sorry guys, I got to check out the list. But what was very interesting is you have the American Medical Spirits Distillery. This is actually later became known as National Distillers, which is still around today. You have the Schniley Distillery, James Thompson and Brothers, which actually became the Glenmore Distillery, a Scottish distillery later. Frankfurt Distillery, which you might know of. I think it's still mentioned on some bottles, but this is the nowadays Jack Daniels. Right after Frankfurt Distillery, we have Brown-Forman. So for those of you who don't know, Brown-Forman is now they make a whole bunch of they own a whole lot of different whiskey brands, one of them being Jack Daniels. And of course, P.H. Stitzel Distillery. So what's interesting is most of the distilleries which were able to produce whiskey throughout Prohibition, funny enough, could stay alive and maintained, and even today are powerhouses in the American whiskey world. Now, a few more interesting distilleries which I found were you had, or let's say, couldn't find a lot on, they were mentioned. So maybe they were distilling, maybe they were just producing or selling their current stock. But we had the Walter P. Chrysler, and I mentioned them before, and yes, this is the Chrysler. They had a distillery. And in 1929, it was named the A.H. Clark Distillery. There was also the Walting Distillery Company. This was a Pennsylvania-based distillery, which was also reported to have produced quite a bit of medical whiskey. And of course, we have James Pepper, which I'll actually do a video on later. But for those of you which are familiar, this is some of the whiskey that they produce. And it's a pretty good whiskey. They even say born in the Republic. They have a very cool historical story. And although they were not distilling whiskey throughout Prohibition, they were able to sell their stock, which meant, or their barrels, which they had aging and maturing, which helped them sustain through Prohibition, but also be successful afterwards. And although some things changed, they're still around today after a new ownership picked them up and built them back up. So I know we didn't go over the history of Prohibition. That wasn't my goal. But I just want to throw out some fun facts and things which I found during my research in Prohibition. Of course, the most interesting for me was Wallgreens and their role in the whiskey world. And a piece of me is always thinking, oh man, it had an unfair advantage. But realistically, they capitalized on it and they made something really big out of themselves while still providing a lot of good old whiskey for the world, or for the Americas. So I gotta say my hat's off to them. And Wallgreens, you did it. Thank you very much from the behalf of the Whiskey March. And yeah, definitely gonna stop by next time I see one, next time I'm in the States. But until then, as always, cheers to you and your next glass of whiskey. Pre-Prohibition or after? Probably after. Bye now.